In our headlines at this hour, Foreign Minister Park Jin returns home from a 3-day visit to Japan this week, following talks with his counterpart Yoshimasa Hayashi and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. And President Yoon Suk-yeol sat down with U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen late Tuesday to discuss financial stability and economic security amid global challenges. The National Assembly has begun a new term with a plenary session on this Wednesday morning amid a host of economic issues including high inflation and high interest rates. Consumer prices are skyrocketing across borders, with authorities in many countries witnessing record levels of inflation. Europe, for its part, is seeing its annual rate at almost 10%, which is also the case over in the U.S. Our Lee Ji-yoon starts us off with details about the current state of affairs.
Countries around the world are fighting to dial back sky-high prices. New numbers from the U.S. last week showed inflation is rising faster than at any point in the past 4 decades. And with Federal Reserve officials debating over a historic 1 percentage point rate hike at next week's meeting, many emerging and advanced markets are further tightening their monetary policies. Just last Friday, top financial officials from the group of 20 nations discussed the surging inflation worldwide and increases in crude oil prices amid the war in Ukraine.
We are all facing a very difficult situation to manage as a finance ministers as well as central bank governor. We are witnessing an alarming increase in risk to food security as the impact of the war in Ukraine and sanctions as well as export restriction. These are all has driven food prices to record level.
The annual inflation rate in European Union's 27 member countries also surged to a record high of 9.6% this month. The EU Statistics Agency says inflation is at its highest level since records for the euro began in 1997. Canada's inflation rate in May also hit a near 4-decade high at 7.7%. South Korea was no exception. Last week, the Bank of Korea raised its policy interest rate by an unprecedented half point in an attempt to lower inflation from 24-year highs.
Everybody, government, tries to avoid inflation and tries to avoid recession, but we're going to have recession.
The Spanish government, meanwhile, said on Tuesday that it's going to impose temporary taxes on banks and energy firms to cover the cost of state measures put in place to help its people amid soaring inflation. Lee Ji-yoon, Arirang News.
And in related news, for the first time in more than a decade, the European Central Bank is also looking to raise its key interest rate. Our Lee Seung-jae has more on the plan ahead.
Amid soaring inflation, the European Central Bank is set to raise its key interest rates for the first time in 11 years. The decision, which is set to be made later this week, was previously hinted at by the ECB chief last month.
As the Governing Council concluded that the conditions underlying our forward guidance have been satisfied, we intend to raise the key ECB interest rates by 25 basis points at our July monetary policy meeting.
However, Lagarde said later that a quarter-point hike would be the intention, while cautioning that no decision had been made. Market experts also believe that current economic conditions show that a 25 basis point would not be enough to tame inflation, and instead, a so-called big step should be made.
The ECB should do more than markets expect. The market expects 0.25 percentage points, whereas the ECB should make it 0.5%. The message must be, we have understood that there is inflation and that we must do something against it. I'm afraid it's only going to be 0.25 points.
Despite calls for a 50 basis point rate hike by many market experts, ECB officials dismissed the prospect of starting interest rate hikes with a half-point move this week. However, others say that with inflation continuing to surge and the euro continuously falling against the U.S. dollar, another rate hike later this year would be inevitable. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
And against that backdrop, the Yoon and Biden administrations have reaffirmed their intentions to ensure economic security and stability. Now, remarks to this end were shared between President Yoon as well as his top finance officials and their U.S. counterpart Janet Yellen. Our Choi Min-jung reports.
South Korea and the United States have agreed to cooperate in stabilizing the foreign exchange market. The decision came after the country's Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho and U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen met in Seoul on Tuesday to discuss key economic issues. The two also agreed to inject liquidity if deemed necessary. Pundits say this opens the door for a potential currency swap between Seoul and Washington. Chu and Yellen did, however, note that South Korea's foreign currency liquidity is still stable. Seoul also said it plans to get on board with Washington-led plans to impose a price cap on Russian oil. Yellen has been seeking support from her counterparts to back the plan to reduce funds flowing into Moscow. Chu emphasized that the measure should be effectively designed to stabilize international oil and consumer prices. The decisions come after President Yoon Suk-yeol held talks with the U.S. Treasury Chief at the presidential office and asked the U.S. to cooperate in stabilizing the currencies of the two countries. Rising inflation, energy prices, and supply chain issues were also discussed.
그리고 앞으로 이런 복합적인 다양한 위기가 지금 전 세계를 험습하고 있는 가운데 한미 간의 이런 포괄적 전략 동맹이 정치 군사 안보에서 또 산업 기술 안보에서 나아가 경제 금융 이런 안보 동맹으로서 더욱 튼튼하게 이어지기를 저도 기대하고.
During talks with the governor of the Bank of Korea, Ms. Yellen said she looks forward to expanding the partnership between the two countries. Yellen also visited an LG Chem battery facility where she highlighted the importance of friendshoring. This involves deepening relationships and diversifying supply chains with trusted economic allies. It's a move aimed at tackling inflationary pressure and supply chain disruptions and preventing countries like China from dominating key technological industries.
We cannot allow countries like China to use their market position in key raw materials, technologies, or products to disrupt our economy or exercise unwanted geopolitical leverage.
Yellen arrived in Seoul on Tuesday for a 3-day trip to South Korea as part of her first Indo-Pacific tour as Treasury Secretary. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
In other news, the latest monthly report by the Finance Ministry points to a slowdown in economic growth here on the local front, largely amid the presence of external risk factors. Our Shin Se-byuk explains.
The Ministry of Economy and Finance have expressed concerns over an economic slowdown in South Korea for the second consecutive month amid worsened external economic conditions. According to the monthly Green Book Economic Assessment report on Wednesday, inflationary pressure has mounted both at home and abroad, which could lead to export growth losing steam. Citing multiple geopolitical risks such as Fed's fast rate hikes, China's economic slowdown, and the prolonged war in Ukraine, the report noted these factors could bring further volatility to the Korean economy. However, the country is on a mild recovery track thanks to improvement in the job market and a rebound in in-person services. South Korea's industrial production in all sectors increased as well. In particular, the manufacturing and service sectors both posted almost 7.5% on-year growth in the month of May. Also, exports, the main driver of the country's economic growth, rose 5.2% on-year in June on demand for chips and petroleum products. It marked 20 months straight that exports have extended their gains, although it was the first time in 16 months that exports posted a single-digit growth figure. One expert said this is because of the so-called stagflation, a mix of slumping growth and high inflation.
Concerns about stagflation, mostly caused by skyrocketing energy prices abroad, are growing amid economic slowdown in South Korea, and that's what hinders the country's export growth.
Meanwhile, the expert said that it's not just external uncertainties, but also domestic factors such as the resurgence in COVID-19 that could accelerate slowdown risk. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
South Korea's imports of materials, parts and equipment from neighboring Japan in the first half of this year hovered on the 15% range, recording the lowest level in 10 years. According to the Trade Ministry on Wednesday, the country's imports of Japanese materials, parts and equipment reached just over $20 billion, or 15.4% of total imports in the first half of this year. The latest figure is also nearly 9% lower compared to the same period 10 years ago. The downward trend has been more visible since the year 2019, when Japan imposed export restrictions on South Korea. During this week's talks with his Japanese counterpart Yoshimasa Hayashi, Foreign Minister Park Jin is reported to have requested a lifting of these restrictions. And in Japan, Seoul's top diplomat Park Jin also met with Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida on Tuesday to convey President Yoon Suk-yeol's commitment to bilateral ties and condolences over the recent passing of former Premier Shinzo Abe. Our Kim Da-mi has more.
Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida is a reliable partner, according to South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol, with whom he can work together to develop friendly and cooperative bilateral relations. Seoul's top diplomat Park Jin delivered this message from the South Korean leader to his Japanese counterpart on Tuesday. He said Kishida listened carefully to Yoon's message and voiced hope of continuing to have good talks with him like they did at the NATO summit in Spain. In the message, Yoon also expressed his condolences over the death of Japan's late former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Topping the talks between Park and Kishida were pending issues between the two countries, namely the issue of compensation for the Koreans Japan subjected to wartime forced labor. Park pledged to what he could do so that there are desirable solutions before the assets of related Japanese firms are liquidated. Regarding the 2015 agreement on the issue of the Korean women subjected to sexual slavery by Japan, the so-called comfort women, he said the South Korean government regards the deal as official and expects the issue to be resolved in accordance with the spirit of the agreement. According to the South Korean Foreign Minister, Kishida said nothing but listen. Though no details are settled yet, Park said he is hopeful that there will be a summit between the leaders of the two countries once there have been solutions outlined to various issues. Also on Tuesday, Park and Kishida agreed to closely cooperate on revitalizing people-to-people exchanges, like the recent resumption of flights between Gimpo and Haneda airports. Kim Da-mi, Arirang News.
Back on the local front, authorities have announced additional antivirus measures on this Wednesday. Now, amid forecasts that the daily COVID-19 tally may surpass 100,000 in the near future, authorities are banning in-person visits to venues vulnerable to infection, such as nursing facilities. Now, staff at these facilities must take a PCR test once a week. Also on the testing and treatment front, 70 more screening centers will be set up nationwide, while some 4,000 more hospital beds will be allocated for COVID-19 patients. South Korea has reported 76,402 new COVID-19 infections as of midnight Wednesday. The Omicron subvariant BA.5 has been found to account for more than half of the country's total COVID-19 cases in the third week of July, up from 24% in the first week of the month. Now, amid the rebound in COVID-19, those hoping to make the most of their summer holiday are nonetheless heading to the beach with basic COVID-19 precautions in mind, of course. And for a glimpse of these scenes by the seaside, I have my colleague Kim Jung-shil standing by at the Naksan Beach over in Gangwon-do province. Jung-shil, welcome.
Hi, Sunny.
Right, so do tell us a bit about the sights and sounds there where you are.
Well, Sunny, hello. I can't quite hear you, but it is very, very hot in here. I'm currently at Naksan Beach in Yangyang County on the East Coast. Very hot. As you can see, there aren't many people. There are people here, but there aren't too many right now. Authorities say the monsoon season combined with the recent surge in COVID-19 cases have resulted in a slow comeback for visitor numbers. The beach opened on July 8th and will remain so until August 21st. Naksan Beach is one of South Korea's most popular beaches, along with Busan's Haeundae and Gangneung's Gyeongpo-dae Beach. Also, around this time of year, children finish school and their summer vacation begins. and the social distancing ban was lifted in April, people can enjoy a mask-free return to the beaches. But some people we met here are still wearing masks. We talked to some of the visitors on the beach earlier. Here's what they had to say to us earlier.
We came early when there aren't too many people because we were worried about COVID-19. We postponed this trip last year and the year before. This time we came when there were fewer people.
I think it's best to go to places with fewer people in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. I always wear a mask and try my best to prevent the virus from spreading.
Right, of course. Changshi, she seems to be quite worried about COVID-19 there. So what are local authorities there in Naksan Beach saying about the situation?
Well, Sunny, local authorities are saying that they're paying close attention to government guidance when it comes to COVID-19. Well, up until last year, Naksan Beach, along with other beaches in South Korea, had mandatory mask wearing on the beach. There were also measures such as temperature checks and QR check-ins to keep track of every visitor. Authorities from another popular beach, Busan's Haeundae, told me earlier that visitor numbers had dropped by 27% compared to years before the pandemic. But for now, visitors can come to the beach mask-free. That's all I have for now. Back to you, Sunny.
All right, Jung-shil, thank you very much for that. Now, that was our Kim Jung-shil at Naksan Beach in Gangwon-do province with the latest from there. Well, that ends the first half of the Daily Report. We'll come back with the second half in a few minutes. Stay with us.
Arirang, what matters?
우리가 하나가 되는 순간 만세 밝은 내일을 향해 오늘도 만세 난 자유로이에 춤을 춰 만세 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 우리가 하나가 되는 순간 만세 밝은 내일을 향해 오늘도 만세 난 자유로이에 춤을 춰 만세
Welcome back. Efforts to tame inflation by raising interest rates, especially by the U.S. Federal Reserve, are affecting the $1 exchange rate here in South Korea, which in turn appears to be fanning fears about financial stability. For more on this reality and ways to address it, I have Professor Choi Sang-yup from Yonsei University. Welcome, Professor Choi.
Thank you.
I also have Professor Cho Gyubong at Handong Global University live on the line. Professor Cho, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Professor Cho, we'll start here then. Let's begin with the declining value of the Korean won against the US dollar in recent days. Perhaps we could start with a few words on the cause of that decline and the consequences.
Sure. So let me be first clear that the depreciation of Korean currency won is mainly driven by a strong dollar, which is a global phenomenon. That indicates that it's not a particular problem of Korean currency, giving us some comfort given our painful experience from financial crisis and taper tantrum more recently. Let me give you some specific numbers. So this year, both euro and British pound have depreciated about 12% against the dollar. And this number is even higher for Japanese yen, which is known to be a safe haven currency, by 20%. So in this sense, about 10% depreciation of Korean currency doesn't necessarily signal that the Korean economy is in a trouble. However, as long as this strong dollar continues, which I believe so, the weakening won will also prevail. So this is because of the relatively expansionary monetary policy stance of the ECB and BOJ compared to Federal Reserve. So to understand the consequences of this weak won on the real economy, we have to consider two contrasting channels through which weaker currency affect the real economy. So the first channel is trade channel. So weakening won will make domestic exporters more competitive in foreign market, which will increase their net export and eventually GDP. However, we also shouldn't forget about the second channel, which is called the financial channel. So according to this channel, the strong dollar worldwide will increase the funding costs of domestic firms and banks from global financial market, which will decrease their credit, investment, and eventually GDP. So of course, at this point, we need more rigorous analysis to determine which effect is larger. But to me, it seems like that the downside risk coming from the second channel is dominating.
All right, I see. And against the backdrop then, Professor Cho, speaking to members of the foreign media in Bali on the sidelines of the G20 finance ministers meeting, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho shrugged off short-term risks of capital outflows from South Korea despite its weakening currency. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that the Finance Minister Chu does not have a significant concern about the Korean economy. In particular, corporations have financial soundness. Theoretically, the capital flows can be determined by the difference of expected returns on investment between countries. Of course, investors consider the effect of change in foreign exchange rate as well as corporations' profitability for evaluating the expected returns. As for profitability, the more profits corporations make, the more return investors expect. So many firms in South Korea are likely to have not so much serious problems in terms of profitability right now, based on the Chu's decision, Chu's their thoughts. However, in the short run, external conditions such as global economic conditions and financial market conditions are also important factors for the capital flows and fluctuations of foreign exchange rates. Depending on these external conditions, the capital outflows temporarily can sharply rise, even though there is little serious concern about firms' health and the financial soundness. Such a situation could not last long, but persistently bad or uncertain external conditions could hurt firms' health. Actually, that's the different scenario. So current economic situation seems to be uncertain. Actually, that's the risk, I think.
Right, so the uncertainty is the risk. And against that then, Professor Che, the fall in value of the Korean won also appears to have affected our foreign exchange reserves. Would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So there are two starlight facts about Korea's foreign reserve. First of all, the level of foreign reserve itself is very high, which exceeds $400 billion. That reflects our trauma from Asian financial crisis. But at the same time, according to foreign reserve adequacy ratio, including like various factors like the value of imports or short-term debt, our position is not bad, but not really great either. So against this background, I like to emphasize that the declining value of foreign reserve itself doesn't necessarily indicate that Bank of Korea had to actively defend the value of Korean currency. And that's because if our portfolio is diversified in different currencies whose value also have depreciated against the dollar, it could look like a decline in the dollar value of foreign reserve. However, since we don't really have much information on the precise currency composition of a foreign reserve, it's difficult to say how much of the decline is driven by so-called valuation effect and how much of the decline is driven by the active FX management of the BOK. But what really bothers me is the speed of decline in foreign reserve compared to other countries with a large holding of foreign reserve. For example, despite the depreciation of their currency, our neighboring countries like China and Japan actually observed the increase in the dollar value of their foreign reserve. So in this sense, the monetary authority should actively monitor the development of the FX market.
Right, I see. And Professor Cho, what do you believe are the broader implications of this drop in our Forex reserves?
Actually, the Professor mentioned the numbers related to our foreign exchange reserve, right? And so let me again speak the actual number of a foreign reserve. So at the end of October, 2021, and the foreign reserve have 469 billion US dollar. But right now, the level is decreased up to 438 billion US dollar at the end of the last month. The level of the foreign exchange reserve is 438 billion US dollar is not below historically, Professor already mentioned. Based on the level of foreign exchange reserves, over pessimism about the foreign reserves is a little relevant, I think. However, this situation is not optimistic. And the problem is the pace of decline in foreign reserves. In just 8 months, the level of reserves is down by 7%. I'm not sure how long this trend will last. You know, the level of foreign reserve is related to the central bank intervention in the foreign exchange market. So when the foreign exchange market is stable, there will be no reason for the central bank to intervene in the market aggressively. Actually, it depends on when the foreign exchange rate stabilizes under the condition of the world economy.
Right, I see. Professor Che, do you suppose then that a currency swap deal with the US will perhaps serve to address some of the possible challenges resulting from the retreat in our Forex reserves?
Well, people often say that we have to accumulate more and more reserve, especially in terms of liquid asset to prevent a future currency crisis. But we shouldn't forget that there is an opportunity cost of holding such liquid asset, which is low returns. So in this sense, having a currency swap line with the US could be a viable option to minimize such cost, at the same time prevent a speculative attack by sending a strong signal to market participants. So this kind of policy could be very effective during a liquidity crunch, like the episode we saw in March 2020. However, I don't think having a dollar subline is panacea, and I'm a bit skeptical about its role in alleviating pressure on won depreciation. And again, that is because the weakening won in recent days is not really driven by a short-term dollar liquidity problem. So it's also quite interesting that countries with indefinite dollar credit swap line have also experienced large depreciation, actually larger than Korean won. Nevertheless, it's, as a precautionary measure, it's always good to have an additional policy instrument if things go south.
Right, and that being said then, Professor Cho, are there any other options out there to perhaps address the current challenges faced by South Korea, aside from the currency swap deal?
Actually, it's a very difficult question, right? Honestly, it's difficult to suggest the truly effective policies to address the current risks in the foreign exchange market right now. I think the central bank's role is crucial. The Bank of Korea has raised the policy interest rate, including the recent big step. Basically, monetary policy is able to affect the capital flows as well as foreign exchange rate. However, currently, economic uncertainty might dominate the effect of such a monetary policy. In addition, the Fed has raised the federal fund rate significantly as well. This situation may make the recent difficulties complicated. So the future monetary policy is very important. Also, can think about the central bank's intervention to address the current challenges through the appropriate timing and the signals to a foreign exchange market. I'd like to stress that the key player is the central bank, Bank of Korea, rather than presenting concrete policies. Yeah.
Right, so the role of the central bank is very crucial then. Professor Che, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho has also spoken about exempting taxes on income from investing in Korean treasury bonds to attract foreign investment. What are your thoughts on this planned measure?
Well, first of all, many advanced economies are already exempting interest income on treasury bonds for foreign investors. So in this sense, we are moving toward the right direction in the long term. But policymakers also have to consider a careful cost-benefit analysis before preemptive implementation of the policy. And that's because the cost of this policy is quite straightforward, which is a decline in government tax revenue. But potential benefit for this policy is much more difficult to predict. And that is because it ultimately depends on the foreign investors' demand on domestic Korean bonds, which is also a function of so many factors other than the tax rate. I'm pretty sure the Ministry of Economy and Finance is doing their job and conducting careful analysis and considering many different scenarios.
Right. Professor Cho, President Yoon Suk-yeol's meeting with U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen largely addressed economic security, as mentioned by my colleague Choi Min-jung earlier on. What issue caught your attention with regard to their talks?
As you mentioned, the President Yoon talked about the expanding cooperation to economic security. Of course, it's important for both countries to make concerted efforts while global diplomatic relations become more complicated under the Russian invasion of Ukraine. However, I would like to point out another topic, and that's the necessity of policies for the economically vulnerable. Actually, I was impressed that they addressed the necessity of policies for the economically vulnerable. The worse the economic conditions are, the more severe the economically vulnerable are likely to be. So I hope that the administration keeps focusing on the economically vulnerable in terms of a combination of a variety of economic policies based on the market mechanism.
Right. Professor Che, Yellen called for a price cap scheme on Russian oil during her talks with Finance Minister Cho-kyung-ho, who largely appeared to support that particular plan. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's a difficult question to answer because it involves both economics and politics, which is not my expertise. But given the political relationship between Korea and the U.S., the decision to join this price cap seems to be a reasonable decision. However, from an economic perspective, I'm not still entirely convinced by expected effect of this price cap on global oil prices and also global inflation for two reasons. First of all, I'd like to ask, what is the optimal price cap? And it's really difficult to pin down what is the optimum price cap. If the cap is too high, it's useless anyway. And if the cap is too low, then it could push out Russia from supplying global oil. So it will cause another problem. So even if we're able to find the optimum level of price, it still requires the participants not to leave this deal. But over time, participating countries have more and more incentive to deviate from this collusion. And especially, I'm not entirely sure whether China and India are truly participating in this scheme.
Right, a lot of uncertainty there as
Yes.
well then. All right, Professor Che, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Professor Jo, thank you very much for being with us live at this hour. Following a delay that lasted 52 days, the National Assembly finally began a new term with a plenary session on this Wednesday morning. And among the top tasks undertaken by lawmakers there was the passing of a resolution to set up a special legislative committee in charge of advancing bills to tackle issues related to the cost of living amid high inflation and interest rates, such as fuel taxes. During its opening address, the major opposition Democratic Party called on the Yoon administration to place priority on people's livelihoods, vowing to work with the ruling People Power Party to this end. And the PPP, for its part, will make its own address on Thursday before the two parties seek to finalize the leadership of 18 regular committees. An annual U.S. report on human trafficking has downgraded South Korea's efforts to eradicate the crime, largely finding fault with the country's light punishment of offenders and weak protection of victims. Our Min Suk-yeol has details.
South Korea no longer belongs to the Tier 1 category in the U.S. State Department's Human Trafficking Report. The country has been downgraded to Tier 2 for not fully meeting the minimum international standards for eliminating trafficking. In the 2022 Trafficking in Persons report shared on Tuesday, the State Department says South Korea failed to keep up with sustained efforts to root out trafficking, citing fewer prosecutions and investigations of suspected traffickers. It also raised concerns over the country's victim identification guidelines and the court's light sentences for trafficking-related crimes, which often undermine efforts to hold offenders accountable. It's a big shock for the country, which had been listed in Tier 1 for the past 2 decades. The report now calls on the government to do more to comply with the international standards for the protection of victims, prosecution of traffickers, and prevention of trafficking. Matthew Friedman, a human trafficking expert with more than 30 years of experience, says South Korea can do better to protect the victims.
Let's say that a person was tricked and deceived and forced into prostitution, which could be an illegal activity. But because they were not identified as being a traffic victim, when in fact they were, because the protocol doesn't identify them as that, they could go to jail for doing illegal activities.
Friedman warns that it's important to identify victims and protect them so they don't end up in jail for the illegal activities they were forced to do. Another point he mentions is the lenient punishment for traffickers in South Korea.
Oftentimes the legal system, although it works to arrest people, the crime punishment is very lean. And it could be less than a year for a trafficker. So if the punishment is very lean, then there's more of a temptation to traffic people because even if you get caught, the implications are not really extreme.
Seoul's foreign ministry says it will closely review the report with relevant ministries to see if there are any parts that need to be corrected or clarified, and vowed to step up its anti-trafficking measures. Along with South Korea, the report also listed Japan, Norway, and Switzerland in Tier 2. Yoon Suk-yeol, Arirang News.
Following a successful ground test in late June, South Korea's advanced fighter jet has also made a successful flight test, which pundits say ranks the country 8th in the world to have developed a supersonic fighter jet. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Peunji has this coverage.
South Korea's newly developed 4.5 generation fighter, the KF-21, roars into the air for its first test flight. It took off at 3:40 p.m. from Sacheon Airport, located in the south of the country, and flew for around 30 minutes at 400 kilometers per hour. Tuesday's flight came more than 20 years after the country officially announced that it will develop its own advanced fighter jet, and 6 years after actual development began by Korea Aircraft Industries, or KAI, in 2015. With that, South Korea is edging closer to becoming the 8th country in the world to have developed its own supersonic fighter jet. So far, countries including the U.S., Russia, China, Japan, France, Sweden, and the European Consortium, comprised of UK, Germany, Italy, and Spain, have developed such aircraft. For the next 4 years, more prototypes will be put test flown.
Until 2026, we will test the aircraft by putting prototypes through around 2,000 flights. Manufacturing will begin from 2026, and a total of 120 aircraft will be given to the South Korean Air Force by 2032.
Developing the KF-21 is a key part of South Korea's project that's aimed at replacing its fleet of aging F-4s and F-5s. It was developed to fly at a top speed of 1.8 times the speed of sound, and is capable of carrying 4 medium-range air-to-air missiles called a Meteor that has a combat range of 200 kilometers and can fly at Mach 4.5. Peunji, Arirang News.
As a sign of the times, job applications are looking to become more interactive experience. In some cases, both the employer and prospective employee take turns to ask and answer questions during a job interview. Arirang tells us why.
What do Generation MZs value the most when looking for a job?
I prefer companies with less overtime.
More than anything, I want a high salary.
It seems people in their 20s and 30s think the work-life balance and salaries are the most important factor when getting a job. And some company officials are saying their Generation Z employees are more individualistic than other workers.
A survey conducted by one of the country's most well-known job-searching websites, Saramin, shows that over 62% of the companies said workers in their 20s and 30s place the most value in a work-life balance. 59% said that their MZ employees are more focused on how they can grow professionally. To meet those needs, a new type of interview has emerged in the application process.
Job interviews were usually one way. Company officials ask applicants questions and interviewees answer them. But the new type of interview is called a reverse interview. Interviewees need to ask a series of questions to interviewers to find out if the company is suitable for them.
The candidates are also assessed based on the quality of their questions. There's also another type of interview format that targets young workers.
We tried out a new interview method to recruit new employees who are suitable for the job. The company got workers in their 20s and 30s to participate as interviewers to find out certain aspects of the MZs being interviewed.
One expert says companies need to be aware that the modern young professional has different needs.
A person must be compensated reasonably depending on their accomplishments. That's how it works for Generation MZs. Companies should also create a flat organizational structure where people can work more flexibly.
He added that companies can motivate young employees by providing opportunities to grow together with the company. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
Elsewhere, the UK is battling a brutal heatwave that's also fueling a record number of wildfires. Our Kim Hyo-son has more on the plight there.
Amid an unprecedented heat wave, the UK on Tuesday saw its highest ever registered temperature, with a provisional reading of 40.2 degrees Celsius at London's Heathrow Airport. The country's weather service further warned that they expected temperatures to keep rising throughout the day, adding that multiple other locations in the UK had exceeded the 40-degree mark as well. London's firefighting authority explained they had been facing a major challenge due to a surge in the number of fires amid a record-breaking heat wave.
The vast majority of which are, of course, linked to the unprecedented weather that we've been currently experiencing over the last 2 days in particular.
And England, we've been here for 25 years and we've never known heat like this year. So over the time it has escalated a lot. It's very worrying, yeah.
Climate scientists say the once unthinkable temperatures in the UK were likely to become more common in the coming years. The extreme heat engulfing parts of Western Europe is leading to wildfires in France, Spain, and Portugal. Over 1,700 people have died in Spain and Portugal from heat-related causes over the past week. Kim Hye-sun, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. In the US, reports say that lawmakers have been arrested during a protest. According to coverage, 17 members of Congress, all of them Democrats, were arrested during an abortion rights protest in front of the Supreme Court. The incident on Tuesday saw at least 35 people arrested in total following a march from the US Capitol to the court. Capitol Police said that after failing to heed 3 warnings, protesters were apprehended for crowding, obstructing, or disturbing traffic. Among those arrested were Democratic Representatives Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar. Both pro- and anti-abortion supporters have been demonstrating near the Supreme Court for almost a month now, since the Supreme Court ruled that nationwide abortion protections previously granted under Roe v. Wade are not a constitutional right. In the case of Twitter versus Musk, the social media platform has made headway as a judge ruled that the company's lawsuit against the Tesla CEO should go to trial in October. The decision was made on Tuesday and will see a 5-day trial take place regarding Musk's pullout of a $44 billion acquisition agreement. Twitter had wanted the trial to take place in September, while Musk's legal team proposed a timeline for early next year. During the hearing, Twitter argued that the continued uncertainty over the outstanding deal and legal proceedings, quote, inflicts harm on Twitter every day, and that delays could threaten financing. Meanwhile, Musk's lawyer claimed that the Tesla CEO has no incentive to drag the case out, but that the complex case needs more time. Shares of Netflix jumped on Tuesday after the streaming giant disclosed that its loss in subscribers during the second quarter was smaller than expected. Netflix had warned investors of a potential loss of 2 million subscribers, but the actual loss was just 970,000. Currently sitting at more than 220 million subscribers, Netflix says it expects to gain 1 million subscribers in the third quarter. The streaming giant is also expanding measures to charge people for sharing accounts. Initially beginning in 5 Latin American countries on August 22nd, new features called Add Home will be available to users. It will cost $2.99 to add the extra home. Netflix said that people can add or remove these homes at any time and plans to roll out the feature globally by the end of the year. Amid soaring temperatures across Europe, 2 bars are offering a cool place of refuge. In Paris, locals escaped Tuesday's 41 degrees Celsius heatwave with drinks at the Paris Ice Bar. The venue, decorated with ice sculptures, sits at -20 degrees and guests need to don scarves and sweaters to cope with the cold. Ice bar employees warn those who enter to be careful of the temperature difference between the bar and the outside. For around $25, customers can borrow a jacket and get a 25-minute experience, which includes 2 drinks and 1 shot. Over in Prague, customers enjoyed a similar atmosphere at the ice pub. The pub is running at full capacity and is slightly warmer than its Parisian counterpart at -7 degrees. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Wednesday afternoon. The whole country is heat-stricken, especially the southern regions. You might feel even hotter due to the high humidity. The UV index is also high, and it's going to be extremely high in Jeollanam-do province. You could get sunburned in less than 20 minutes, so take steps to avoid the sun. While checking today's high temperatures, Seoul is reaching 30 degrees Celsius, and it's even hotter in the southern regions, which are grappling with blistering heat. Gyeongsang-do and Jeollanam-do provinces and Jeju Island are still under a heat advisory, so please try to keep yourself cool and hydrated. And the rain will start from tonight. Southern regions will see 70 millimeters and even up to 80 millimeters in some regions, along with stormy conditions. And there's less rain in the capital and Gangwon-do province, just 5 to 30 millimeters. And the rain will stop by tomorrow morning, but we do have frequent showers and nationwide rain in the forecast for the weekend. Now, let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
Right, and that brings us to the end of this edition of the Daily Report. We'll be back with more coverage tomorrow. Join us then.